In the early hours of March 27th, 1992, the serene atmosphere of the St. Pius X convent in Kottayam, Kerala, was shattered by a chilling discovery. Sister Abhaya, a 21-year-old nun known for her bright spirit and unwavering faith, was found dead. Her body was discovered at the bottom of a well in the convent compound, and at first glance, it appeared to be a tragic accident. The initial assumption was that she had taken her own life, possibly overwhelmed by the pressures of her religious vows. The news spread quickly, leaving her fellow nuns and the community in shock. Abhaya was remembered for her kind nature, her dedication to her religious duties, and her warmth toward everyone around her. She had a future ahead of her, full of promise and commitment to her faith. She was deeply involved in the convent's daily activities, participating in prayer services and tending to the needs of the community. She was not someone who seemed troubled or in distress, making the idea of suicide difficult for many to accept. There was a sense of disbelief that a young woman with so much to live for would end her life in such a way. The police initially ruled the case as a suicide, partly because of the circumstances surrounding the death. The well where Abhaya's body was found was located in a remote corner of the convent. The fact that her body was discovered in such a place seemed to fit the narrative of a person who had chosen to end their life in solitude. Yet, even the officers at the scene could sense that something wasn't right. There were no signs of a struggle, no marks on her body that suggested she had fought for her life. However, there were details in the crime scene that didn't sit well with the investigators. The position of the body, the lack of clear evidence for a suicide, and the strange fact that no one had heard any sounds of distress during the night raised suspicions. As days turned into weeks, the investigation seemed to stall. The police were left with no clear answers, and the case gradually slipped into obscurity. It became just another unsolved mystery, overshadowed by other news stories and tragedies. But there was something deeply unsettling about Abhaya's death that wouldn't fade away. Her fellow nuns and friends were haunted by the questions that remained unanswered. Why was she found in that well? Why was her life so abruptly taken? And perhaps most troubling of all, who was responsible? Rumors began to swirl among the local community. Some whispered that the death was not a suicide but a murder, while others speculated that the young nun had been silenced for knowing too much. What was she possibly aware of that led to her death? These theories grew louder over the years, despite the police's inability to make progress. The case seemed to grow colder with time, but it was far from being forgotten. People in Kottayam refused to let it go, sensing that there was more to Abhaya's tragic end than met the eye. Then, as the years went by, a small but crucial detail came to light. A witness had seen something unusual the night before Abhaya's death. This eyewitness had remained silent, possibly out of fear, but their statement suggested that Abhaya had been in the company of two individuals just hours before her body was discovered. The witness, however, couldn't remember much more, and the case once again ground to a halt. But that tiny seed of doubt was enough to keep the case alive in the minds of those who knew the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. Little did they know, it would take another decade before the case truly began to unravel. Nearly a decade passed with little to no progress in the investigation of Sister Abhaya's death. The initial conclusion that she had taken her own life seemed to remain unchallenged, and the case grew colder with every passing year. But in 2002, an unexpected breakthrough reignited hope that the truth would finally emerge. Forensic evidence that had been overlooked during the early stages of the investigation was revisited, leading to a shocking revelation. Abhaya's death was not a suicide, but a murder. A fresh examination of the crime scene uncovered inconsistencies that had previously gone unnoticed. The police discovered that the location of the well where Abhaya's body had been found had been carefully staged. It wasn't a random spot, and it appeared someone had deliberately placed her body there, ensuring it was hidden from immediate view. Additionally, an autopsy report conducted years after the original investigation revealed that Abhaya had suffered blunt force trauma to the head before being thrown into the well. This crucial piece of information made it clear that her death was not an accident, The evidence pointed toward murder, but the question remained, who would want to kill a young, devout nun who had dedicated her life to the religious community? The answer, though shocking, began to surface as investigators revisited the lives of those closest to Abhaya in her final days. Two names repeatedly emerged, Father Thomas Cotter and Sister Sephi. Both had been present at the convent around the time of Abhaya's death, and both had a troubling connection to her. Father Thomas, a respected figure within the community, had long been regarded as a trusted priest, but his interactions with Abhaya had always seemed a little too close for comfort. There were whispers about his behavior, rumors that he had been involved in inappropriate conduct within the convent. At first, no one took these rumors seriously, but now, in the wake of new evidence, they began to look like a much darker part of the story. Sister Sephi, a fellow nun, had been seen with Abhaya in the days leading up to her death. She, too, had been a figure of authority in the convent, but her relationship with Abhaya had raised eyebrows in the past. The two women were often seen in quiet conversations, and some of their colleagues had noted that there was an unusual tension between them. Was there something more going on behind the scenes? Was there a hidden motive tied to these two figures in Abhaya's life? As investigators dug deeper into their backgrounds, they uncovered a disturbing possibility. Abhaya may have stumbled upon a secret that neither Father Thomas nor Sister Sephi could afford to let anyone know. There were rumors that the two had developed a secret relationship, an illicit affair that violated the vows of celibacy they had both taken. The idea that Abhaya had discovered this secret was now the most plausible motive for her death. The nuns and priests at the convent were supposed to live a life of purity and devotion, but the darker side of human nature was creeping into this sacred space. The growing suspicion that Father Thomas and Sister Sephi had something to hide prompted a renewed investigation. However, there was a problem. Despite the mounting evidence, no one had solid proof linking them directly to Abhaya's murder. Their alibis appeared solid, and the physical evidence at the scene remained circumstantial. The case seemed to stall again, with the police unable to make any arrests. But the whispers of a conspiracy continued to grow louder. Some speculated that there were more individuals involved, people within the community who might be protecting Father Thomas and Sister Sephi. And the truth about what had happened to Abhaya was slipping further and further out of reach. Yet the case had taken a dangerous turn, one that would not remain buried forever. Despite the lack of evidence, the truth was beginning to feel like it was within reach. However, it would take years before the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. In 2008, after years of dead ends and frustration, a new lead brought a glimmer of hope to the investigation. Detective Miller, who had taken over the case in recent years, received an anonymous tip that would change the course of the investigation. The tipster, whose identity remained a mystery, claimed that Father Thomas Cotter and Sister Sephi were involved in Abhaya's death. But there was more. This wasn't the full story. The tip hinted at a third individual, a man named Robert, who had once worked at the convent and whose involvement had remained largely overlooked until now. The revelation of Robert's name sparked immediate interest. He had been a lesser-known figure, someone whose presence had faded from the community after leaving the convent years ago. Little was known about him, and at first the idea of his involvement seemed improbable. But the more Detective Miller dug into Robert's past, the more unsettling details began to surface. Robert had been employed at the convent in the late 1980s and had worked closely with both Father Thomas and Sister Sephi. His role had been vague. He had done odd jobs around the convent, maintaining the grounds and assisting with administrative tasks. However, there were whispers that he had more knowledge of the convent's inner workings than he let on. Through careful investigation, Miller discovered that Robert had been in close contact with both Father Thomas and Sister Sephi in the weeks leading up to Abhaya's death. It appeared that the three of them had shared a secret, one that, if exposed, could ruin them all. Robert, who had been working in a secluded part of the convent on the night of Abhaya's death, had overheard a conversation between the two priests. What he had heard was deeply troubling. Abhaya had discovered their secret affair, and they feared she would expose them to the authorities. As the investigation into Robert deepened, it became clear that he had been complicit in the plot to silence Abhaya. In exchange for keeping quiet about the affair, Robert had been promised protection by Father Thomas and Sister Sephi. But when Abhaya began to make subtle inquiries about their relationship, they realized she had to be stopped before she exposed them. Robert, who had grown close to the two, had become an unwitting accomplice. His loyalty to them, or perhaps his fear of them, had kept him silent for years. In the months following the tip-off, Detective Miller managed to track down Robert, who had long since disappeared from the convent's records. He had been living in a distant village under a different name. When the authorities finally confronted him, Robert initially denied any involvement in Abhaya's death. However, after hours of questioning, he began to break down. Robert confessed that he had been part of the conspiracy to murder Sister Abhaya. He revealed that the two religious figures had pressured him into helping cover up the crime. The guilt had eaten away at him for years, but he had been too afraid to speak out. Robert's confession added a new layer of complexity to the case. Not only were Father Thomas and Sister Sephi implicated, but now there was a third party, a man who had once been trusted by the convent and its leaders, yet had chosen to remain silent for decades. The investigation now had a much clearer picture of what had transpired. Abhaya had been murdered because she had discovered the forbidden relationship between Father Thomas and Sister Sephi, and the two had been desperate to protect their secret. With Robert's testimony in hand, the police were finally able to bring charges against Father Thomas, Sister Sephi, and Robert. The case that had remained unresolved for so long was beginning to take shape, but it was still far from over. The road to justice would be long and fraught with challenges, but the truth was no longer a distant hope, it was within reach. In 2019, after 28 years of twists, turns, and dead ends, the case of Sister Abhaya's death finally made its way into the courtroom. The investigation had uncovered crucial new evidence and confessions, but the road to justice was still not easy. The trial promised to be long and fraught with tension, as the prosecution prepared to present a compelling case against the accused, Father Thomas Cotter, Sister Sephi, and Robert, the man who had been complicit in the crime. This was no longer just the case of a young nun's mysterious death. It was a full-scale expose of betrayal, deceit, and corruption within the very heart of a religious community. The trial was held in a packed courtroom, where the public was eager to finally see justice served. The details of the case had shocked the local community, and the media had been following the story closely, ensuring that every twist and revelation was documented. The atmosphere was tense as the prosecution presented its evidence. The key pieces of the case included Robert's chilling confession and the forensic evidence that proved Abhaya had been murdered, not by her own hand but by those she had trusted. The timeline of events, which had been clouded for so long, was now clear. The prosecution argued that Father Thomas and Sister Sephi had been involved in an illicit affair, one that had been discovered by Sister Abhaya. The evidence presented painted a picture of a community bound by secrecy and fear, where the two religious figures had gone to great lengths to conceal their relationship. Abhaya had learned about their secret, and when she threatened to expose them, they realized she had to be silenced. Robert, an accomplice in their web of deceit, had helped stage the crime scene and ensure that Abhaya's death looked like an accident. The motive, they argued, was clear: to protect their reputations and avoid a scandal that would ruin their lives. The defense, however, put up a fierce fight. They sought to discredit Robert's confession, arguing that it had been coerced by the authorities. They claimed that Robert had been pressured into making false statements and that his testimony was unreliable. They also tried to cast doubt on the forensic evidence, suggesting that there could have been another explanation for Abhaya's death. Their strategy was to undermine the credibility of the prosecution's case and create enough doubt in the minds of the jurors to avoid conviction. Despite the defense's attempts to deflect blame, the prosecution's case was strong. The evidence, combined with Robert's confession, painted an undeniable picture of a calculated murder. As the trial continued, the tension in the courtroom grew. The victims were not just Sister Abhaya and her grieving family, but the entire community, which had placed its trust in the hands of those who had taken an oath to serve and protect. The betrayal cut deep, and the fear that such corruption could thrive behind the sacred walls of the convent was felt by many. The turning point in the trial came when Father Thomas and Sister Sephi took the stand in their defense. Their testimony only added to the mounting suspicion. While they denied any involvement in the murder, their contradictory statements and evasive answers were glaringly suspicious. The prosecution's team carefully dismantled their defense, pointing out inconsistencies in their testimonies and drawing attention to their inability to explain the most critical details of the night of Abhaya's death. It was clear that they were hiding something that was no longer going to stay hidden. In the final days of the trial, the emotional weight of the case was undeniable. The family of Sister Abhaya, who had endured years of uncertainty and grief, sat in the courtroom, hoping for justice. It was a bittersweet moment for them. While they could never bring back their beloved sister, niece, and friend, they could finally see the people responsible for her death face the consequences of their actions. The jury deliberated for days, weighing the evidence and testimony they had heard. The case was complex, filled with layers of lies and half-truths, but in the end the truth was undeniable. Father Thomas Cotter, Sister Sephi, and Robert were found guilty of murder. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the case, but it was a hollow victory. The years of pain, confusion, and loss that had plagued Abhaya's family could never be fully healed. The impact of the case extended far beyond the trial. It exposed deep flaws within the community and raised uncomfortable questions about the abuse of power within religious institutions. While the courtroom drama was over, the fallout from the case continued to reverberate through the community. The people of Kottayam were left to grapple with the truth, and the shocking revelations of what had occurred within the convent walls would stay with them for years to come. For Sister Abhaya, the truth had come too late, but at least it had come. The conviction of Father Thomas Cotter, Sister Sephi, and Robert in 2019 brought a sense of closure to the long unsolved case of Sister Abhaya's death. After 28 years of unanswered questions, the relentless pursuit of justice had finally paid off, but the aftermath of the trial left the community reeling. While the perpetrators were held accountable for their actions, the deeper consequences of their betrayal would ripple through the religious institution and the lives of many people for years to come. Sister Abhaya's family, who had endured decades of pain, could not fully embrace the justice they had longed for. The court had delivered the verdict, but it couldn't undo the years of uncertainty, grief, and sorrow they had faced. Her parents, who had never truly believed that their daughter's death was a suicide, had never stopped searching for answers. Throughout the long investigation, they had fought not just for justice for Abhaya, but also for the truth to be known. Now, with the perpetrators convicted, there was a sense of relief, but the scars of the years of emotional turmoil remained. Abhaya's death had altered the course of their lives forever, and no verdict could bring her back. The community, too, was shaken by the revelation of what had transpired within the convent. For decades, St. Pius X convent had been a place of reverence, a sanctuary for those seeking peace and spiritual growth. But the discovery that it had been the backdrop for a conspiracy of lies and corruption rocked the foundation of trust many had placed in the institution. The church, which had long been seen as a symbol of purity and moral authority, now stood as a symbol of betrayal. Members of the congregation, once loyal and devout, began to question the integrity of their leaders and the true nature of the faith they had devoted their lives to. The fallout from the trial created a wave of disillusionment that would not easily be washed away. For the religious community, the consequences of the trial went far beyond the immediate scandal. The trust in their leadership had been irrevocably damaged. Father Thomas and Sister Sephi, once pillars of the community, were now disgraced figures, their names forever associated with the horrific crime that had stained the convent. Those who had once looked up to them as spiritual guides now saw them as perpetrators of a terrible secret. The impact of their actions went beyond just the murder of one young woman. It had shaken the very principles upon which the church had been built. Many began to question how such corruption had been allowed to fester behind the sacred walls for so long. The case also prompted a wider discussion about the abuse of power within religious institutions. The secrecy, the lies, and the cover-up had gone unnoticed for years, hidden by the sanctity of the church and the reverence people held for its leaders. But as more details came to light, it became clear that Abhaya's death was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of misconduct and abuse within the religious community. Survivors of other similar abuses came forward, encouraged by the courage of Abhaya's family and the truth that had finally been exposed. The case became a catalyst for wider investigations into the conduct of church leaders and their responsibility to uphold the values they preached. While the legal process had concluded, the reverberations of the case continued to echo in the lives of everyone affected. Abhaya's memory became a symbol of the fight for justice, a reminder that no matter how deeply a conspiracy is hidden, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. But for those who had been a part of the community, the journey to healing was far from over. They had to reconcile the betrayal of the very institution they had once trusted with their faith. Many struggled to come to terms with the realization that their beliefs had been manipulated for the personal gain of those they had looked up to. The process of rebuilding trust would take time, and the scars left by the case would never fully heal. In the end, Sister Abhaya's tragic death became more than just a story of a young woman's life. Cut short, it became a turning point, a call to action, and a powerful reminder of the need for accountability. The truth, once buried beneath layers of lies, had finally emerged, but the cost had been high. The aftermath of the case was a painful, ongoing process of reckoning with the darkness that had existed within the very heart of a trusted institution. Though justice had been served, it was clear that the road to healing would be a long and difficult one for everyone involved.